TV.
Welcome to another episode of Doctor Who Too Hot for TV. We are the podcast that looks at all things Doctor Who Extended Universe, from Big Finish to BBC books, comic strips to short trips, BBVs to AVs, and anything even more tenuous and spurious than that. Today's guest is a one-time TV and film journalist, now working in higher ed comms, who once got told by Ken Loach that he sounded like a Dalek. I'm joined today by Michael Mills. Michael, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Dylan. It's hot, isn't it? I don't know if it's still hot when people are listening to this, but in case everyone's forgotten, it's really hot.
It's horrendous. So we thought the best thing to do was to lock ourselves away in some tiny rooms and record a podcast on this lovely day.
It's the done thing, isn't it? It makes me feel like a Big Finish recording artist, like I can really understand their experience.
But with none of the famous Big Finish lunches, unfortunately. No. So you are a rarity in Doctor Who fandom in that you're about one of 3 Doctor Who fans who doesn't have a podcast. So I guess the listeners won't know that much about you. So I thought we'd start by just discussing how you became a Doctor Who fan.
And this is, of course, why I'm gate crashing someone else's podcast, because I was feeling incredibly left out. I'm an absolute wilderness ears kid, so I was born in the 80s, too late to watch Doctor Who when it was on the first time, but was absolutely the right age for Doctor Who around about 1996, when the TV movie came on. And so sure enough, my mum, who knew I was the sort of kid who loved that sort of thing, sat me down to watch it, and I got about halfway through before the man pulled a heart probe out of his chest, and my mum thought, you know what, maybe this isn't Tom Baker and Plant Monsters anymore, maybe I should send him to bed. And that was the sort of false start until a few years later. And it was really around the time that I think they did those repeats of the early Pertwee ones on BBC Two in the late 90s, and really got back into it then, and through UK Gold and stuff, and then BBC iMessage boards and Outpost Gallifrey as it was then. And I mean, that was a time as well when obviously Doctor Who wasn't on air, but it's easy to forget now that it was never coming back. It was an old show. It was it was a weird thing, especially for a kid of about 13 or 14 to have got into. Like I'd suddenly got into, I don't know, the Tripods or something like that. But was following the 8th Doctor novels every single month, Doctor Who magazine, Big Finish audios when I could afford them, because they were expensive, and they only existed in Forbidden Planet, and we didn't have Forbidden Planet in mid-Wales. And so that really got into it, and then they brought back Doctor Who just around the time I was going to 6th form, and had got a bit too old to really enjoy it with childish enthusiasm. But I stuck by it, and I think when it's, I forget who it was, but someone once said that for a lot of people, Doctor Who is almost like your sort of native religion. You might drift away from it for a while, you might get really into it at different points, but it never quite leaves you, does it?
No, that's absolutely true. I can think of several times in my childhood and indeed sort of adult years where I have drifted away from Doctor Who a little bit. Not now. Now I do a podcast about it all the time. So I'm completely immersed in it. But there have been times. You kind of have this thing of when you're a Wilderness Years fan, that Doctor Who is a whole thing, because as you say, it was never coming back. So it's a complete work that you're trying to pick up all the bits of. I'm wondering when you realised it wasn't just a television series. Can you remember that? Or was it always like, oh, well, Doctor Who is this is a television series, a radio show, a book? Or was it like, oh, there's this TV show, oh, there's these books, oh, there's these audio plays?
Yeah, I mean, some of it quite quickly, because although I only got to watch the first half of the TV movie in about 1996, I think I watched the rest of it when they repeated it in Doctor Who Night in the 1999. Not to preempt discussion, but the Radio Times had a comic strip pretty much a week or 2 after. I can't remember exact dates. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, wow, this is amazing. That's how I spoke back then. Certainly with more of a Welsh accent. And really getting into it. So I had that, but then that ended. And of course it had, because Doctor Who was a thing that had been on and it had, not happened. You don't carry on reading, I don't know, Bugs tie-in novels in 2005, do you? When I properly began to understand it, though, was probably around the early noughties, where I'd seen Doctor Who books in the shops. So I picked up one of those. I think the first one I read was probably Storm Harvest, Seventh
Right.
Doctor and Ace, because that had a monster on the front.
Yeah.
And I know those, Mike Tucker and Robert Perry novels now, or certainly at the time, it's that classic thing of, when you're a kid, you have to wait till you grow up and people tell you why what you liked was rubbish. But I subsequently understand that they had a bit of a low reputation at the time because they came off the back of, the Virgin New Adventures that had done all these amazing, incredible things, some fantastic and setting the template for the future, some less well advised. And then Tucker and Perry came along and did, widescreen versions of McCoy era stories. But I have to say, if you were, however old I was at the time, 12, 13, and wanting to get into this, I think they were probably one of the few people who were actually thinking, what would get kids into Doctor Who now. I loved that book. I read, I think, some of their other ones straight off the back. And then I remember being a bit of a shock when I picked up, I think it was like Bullet Time by David A. McKinty as well, thinking, oh, that's the Sylvester McCoy one. I like him. And it was Sarah Jane Smith getting murdered and sleeping with people while Hong Kong is handed over and the Doctor's running a triad. I was like, oh, okay. So I recalibrated. And then, Doctor Who magazine, started reading that. The BFs, actually. I know what you said, the Big Finish audios. It's true what you say about it was something that had finished. And I remember the first time I got my hands on a Big Finish audio. It was either Blood Tide or Cold It, so I can't remember which one it was first. And I picked it up, in the shop, and I couldn't work out what it was because I was vaguely aware, I think, of things like BBV somehow, or certainly the idea that there were fans who did audios. And so I remember listening to it like, is this legit? Is this what's going on here? And then through Doctor Who magazine, really getting into that. So it was a sort of gradual realisation. I think probably stepped up more and more because those audios, we're used to the idea of Audible and Star Wars and Star Trek and everything having radio audio dramas now. But at the time, it was a strange old thing, especially when you couldn't really get them anyway. These weren't BBC Radio 4 dramas that had been re-released or anything. So they were strangely liminal things, to use a phrase, of just being quite confused by them, but also really loving them. And then when Paul McGann was in them as well, that was just another level.
They are an oddity. It's I can't think of, apart from the other stuff that Big Finish do, I can't think of another franchise that has such a vast audio range in the sense of full cast audio plays. I know there's lots of talking books and enhanced talking books for Star Wars and Star Trek and things like that, but I could be wrong here, but I can't think of anything that's got such a vast world kind of attached to them.
No, nothing on the same scale. I think in really recent years, like literally the last 2 or 3 years, I think they've started doing some full cast Star Wars ones.
Oh, really?
Actually written by, I think, Cavan Scott.
Oh, wow.
Because, of course, you need to turn to Doctor Who fandom to find people who've got experience of doing this. It is a slightly strange experience hearing something that isn't Doctor Who or Big Finish done like that. And God bless them, in their publicity, they really have to go to quite a lot of lengths to explain to people. Because even in America, I think, where there's not even the sort of Radio 4 tradition, I think old-timey radio shows is where they think of radio drama. Sort of going, okay, well, they're like audiobooks, but it's lots of people talking, and no one's going to interrupt and tell you that they're picking up the phone. We'll have a sound effect for that. And then, gloriously, I think they even published the script book straight away so that a Star Wars fan can, feel, oh, it's okay, I've got it on my shelf, it's okay.
The only other full cast audio adventure I can think of outside of Big Finish that I've experienced as a tie-in was they did an audio version of an unmade Alien 3 script, and I listened to that at some point during one of the lockdowns on a long walk. But that's the only other thing that I can think of that I've ever consumed, and that's a one-off, and you do get those specials, but it is, as I said, it's an oddity. So today we are looking at 2 Eighth Doctor stories. Now, you've already talked a little bit about only seeing the beginning of the TV movie on transmission. You were saying you probably watched it again as it was repeated as part of a Doctor Who night. But what are your feelings on the Eighth Doctor's era, such as it is? And were you hooked into the audios and the books as the Eighth Doctor almost being your Doctor because you're a child of the 90s?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, he's absolutely my Doctor, which feels like a strange, slightly posing thing to say. Sort of, oh, well, of course, my Doctor is the most obscure one that that no one knows anything about. But he was, because, like I say, when I was getting into it, the only ongoing Doctor Who there was was the novels, was the audio adventures, was the comic strip, because Paul McGann was obviously the only one they could do anything with. And so I do feel a particular affection to that Doctor, and especially that early McGann Doctor, because I do think, even more so since Paul McGann coming and playing the part meant that they could, break free of the writing of the TV movie to a certain extent, because they've got him performing it. And obviously, I don't know, but the sense I get is he's getting older now. It doesn't fit for him to play youthful exuberance the whole time. Yeah. He doesn't need to go all breathless and pitching up like Peter Davison. But that really early, that wide-eyed Doctor who really does, it's a cliche to say it, but does feel like a stepping stone between the classic Doctors and the new Doctors. The TV movie I get the impression that its reputation these days is mixed, being free of being that failed attempt to bring Doctor Who back. But I do think his performance in that, whatever it is, less than 90 minutes, and, these early audios, is just fantastic, really helped by some wonderful writing on the part of, is it Matthew Jacobs who wrote it?
It is Matthew Jacobs, yeah.
Oh, thank God I got that right. About to hand in my card otherwise. But I do think that writing, that wide-eyed, just, especially coming off the back of, the much more darker Machiavellian Seventh Doctor, that romantic view of the world, that excitement of the world and the universe and everything that's in it, and that love and kindness, I think, that comes through. Like, some of those scenes between him and Daphne Ashbrook are just incredible. I think one of my favourite scenes of Doctor Who is their goodbye, where she asks, says, you come with me, and he's really tempted, and that really stuck with me from my first watching. So I do feel a lot of affection towards the Eighth Doctor in particular, and that really early version of him.
I think actually it's interesting what you say about that youthful exuberance, because we're kind of used to him now as an older actor, as an older person playing the part. But going back to Sword of Orion, which we're going to cover shortly, it really is the same version of the Doctor as you get in the TV movie, not the 25 years later Paul McGann that we're used to now. At
the time, it felt like an eternity since Paul McGann had been in Doctor Who, and the idea that he would come back, I mean, we were all sort of went, what? When Christopher Eccleston was coming back. But when Paul McGann came back, it was like, really? This is a gig he did for 3 weeks in Vancouver years ago.
Yeah.
What? Why? I mean, we're thrilled, but why ever does he want to? And I think, as you said, Doctor Who was something that was complete at the time. And this wasn't the same as Doctor Who coming back, but I think it felt like, well, maybe it has a little bit of a future. Maybe it's got a side job in its pensionable years, because they can go forwards with that. And that was just incredible. And though it feels like an age at the time, it's only, 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, it's not a huge gap, but it felt like a long time, as you say. And Paul McGann didn't really do interviews, he didn't do conventions, and he wasn't doing the audios. So he did feel like somebody who had just done the job and was distancing himself from it.
Yeah, and, entirely fairly, because how many people who've been in failed pilots for TV series want to be associated with that for a long time afterwards for purely professional reasons. So it was entirely fine and fair, and I don't think anyone really... That's the thing, I don't think there was any expectation, because internet fan culture obviously didn't exist in the same way then as it did now, where everyone who's been in it can, make themselves a steady income attending conventions for years afterwards and being asked, would you ever come back? Would you ever do a Big Finish? A Big Finish had only been around for a year or two as well at that stage.
Yeah.
So it really did just feel like, oh wow, oh, okay, cool. This is unexpected and lovely, but it is, and like I say, Doctor Who didn't exist in any meaningful sense.
I remember when that first season of McGann's came out, and obviously the Big Finish were releasing one story a month, and they did the Excelsis stories alongside with it, because they were worried that fans weren't going to jump on to Paul McGann and be like, we don't want Paul McGann, we want our normal Doctor. So they released a Davison, a Colin Baker, and a McCoy along with it at the same time.
Yes, I'd forgotten about those, but that is such a little insight into the mindset of the time, isn't it? You can't imagine when they brought back Christopher Eccleston, they were going, don't worry, we've got another Colin Baker box set lined up.
There was also the thing of Jason Haig-Ellery always tells the story of when they were recording these audio plays and they'd convinced Paul McGann to do it, and they were in a studio in Bristol, and Paul McGann received a phone call about 2 hours into the recording, and it was obviously his agent, and they overheard him in the booth just go, no, it's fine. They're fine, nothing to worry about. So it was obviously a call of like, if it was just a bunch of mad fans paying him money to record some fanfic, that the agent was just going to pull him out, essentially.
I hadn't heard that story. Oh, that's like he thought it was in Galaxy Quest or something.
It's exactly like that.
Too hot for TV.
Sword of Orion is an audio drama that was recorded on the 16th and 17th of May 2000 in some studios in Bristol. It was released on the 26th of February 2001. News at the time, Doctor Who fandom was all excited that Paul McGann was coming to audio, obviously. DWM gave away a free CD containing Storm Warning Episode 1 and an exclusive 7th Doctor story called Last of the Titan. It was announced that Bert Kwok would be joining the cast of Lugaroo. Iris Wildtime was getting her first range of audios at Big Finish, and of course, in standard news, the Daleks were to lead the BBC Films assault on the box office, as the Sunday Times reported Greg Dyke was planning to use Doctor Who as one of the possible film properties to take on Hollywood. And obviously that never happened. Also at the time, Tomb of the Cybermen director Maurice Barry had just died, and out on DVD for the first time was Spearhead from Space. On CD we had the Mythmaker soundtrack, Slip Back, and from BBV we had The Rani Reaps the Whirlwind. Novels at the time included Escape Velocity, which was an 8th Doctor book, and Past Doctor adventure Bunker Soldiers with the First Doctor, Stephen and Dodo. The comic strip was the 8th Doctor comic strip, The Adventure Game. Are any of those releases ones you remember enjoying at all?
Well, Escape Velocity was the end of the Trapped on Earth arc, wasn't it?
Of course it was, yeah.
Where they had that massive reboot of the 8th Doctor adventures about halfway through, which, looking back, does feel a bit like, oh, this isn't working, is it? So Etch-a-Sketch ends, oh, we'll blow up Gallifrey and have him be the last of the Time Lords. And you go, what? That's a crazy, strange thing to do with your continuation series. I mean, I don't remember much about Escape Velocity other than I now know what that sculpture is in Brussels as a direct result of it. And that it came after Father Time, which was one of the finest Doctor Who novels ever written.
Yeah.
And then set them off for the next, whatever it was, 3-4 years of really quite good stuff. I mean, I definitely read it. Oh, no, I know what I meant. I know what I remember about Escape Velocity. They introduce a companion by killing off her boyfriend. And then,
yes.
And then barely ever mention it again, other than she occasionally goes, "Oh, it was really sad that he died."
But not that sad. But that always happens in classic Doctor Who.
No, that's
doesn't it?
true. That is, that is very true.
Nyssa mourns for her dad in like one scene in Logopolis, and then that's it.
If Big Finish did audios tying into the beloved and well-remembered 8th Doctor adventure novel series, then there would by now be 3 box sets in which they do God's work and fill in all of that. No, she was actually really upset about it the whole time. The novels were just her on a good day.
They absolutely would have done that. Another little classic release I mentioned there was BBV's play The Rani Reaps the Whirlwind, which I don't know why I've never covered on this podcast, but I remember that being pretty terrible. It definitely has Kate Amara and some Tetraps talking about semen in it. That's all I remember.
I mean, those are the things that would stick with you from it. But I mean, this is it. We've it's easy to forget now. Early Big Finish and late BBV were very much running in parallel, and I think that confusion about what Big Finish was, if you were you didn't have access to the internet the same way. If you picked up DWM and you saw these two things being referred to next to each other, you might just think, oh, is this a whole cottage industry? What's the difference here? Obviously, we now know there's quite a big difference, not least as far as the lawyers are concerned. But, why not? Of course, Paul McGann's getting calls from his agent because they heard that Kate O'Mara got wrapped into filming some stuff about Tetraps and semen a few weeks ago.
Exactly that. It's a very odd story. I know it's written by Pip and Jane Baker, so obviously they've really got their finger on the pulse of what 90s popular culture is. I remember it being set in bits of it set in nightclubs and stuff like that, and it was just all so amdram that it was kind of embarrassing. But it's the only time Kate O'Mara really comes back to play the Rani. The Big Finish never got her.
No, that is very strange, isn't it? I mean, I know they did bring back the Rani for a couple of appearances. I don't know if this is the case, or if it's just something I've made up in my head, but I get the feeling that she was going to come back, but then unfortunately was quite ill. But as you say, it's a weird little artefact that and Dimensions and Time were the two things that she was lured back to the role for.
Yeah, I think Pip and Jane Baker were really quite protective of the character of the Rani, and I think now they can't use the Rani again, so there's only that one story where she's played by somebody else.
Oh, well, that makes sense. I mean, I won't hear a bad word said against Pip and Jane Baker because, from what I understand, they were the only people interested in producing Doctor Who for about 6 months in 1986.
They get a bit of a bad rep because they're sort of traditional storytellers, shall we say.
Yes, yes.
Too hot for TV.
When the TARDIS is stolen, the Doctor and Charlie track it to the ship of a salvage team led by Captain Jensen. Jensen's team come across a huge abandoned Star Destroyer, but when a crew member is murdered, the Doctor and Charlie are found with the body and the crew suspect that they are the killers. But as the Star Destroyer awakens, so too do the Cybermen, who begin to hunt and convert more of the crew. Jensen reveals herself to be an android who hopes to enlist the Cybermen in the android war with the humans. But with the ship approaching an iron storm, Jensen realises the Cybermen cannot be trusted, and as the ship is damaged and the Cybermen slowly get sucked into space, Jensen sacrifices her life to save Charlie's.
Too hot for TV.
So, you chose this. Why this story?
I didn't like the accusatory tone in your voice just then, Dylan. You chose this, listeners.
I'm not accusing you of anything. I very much enjoyed revisiting it, but so why did you choose this particular story?
I chose it because one of the things that kind of fascinates me about that Wilderness Years fiction is that it really does break into two eras. You know, after... I don't think Doctor Who ever felt more dead than it did in the late 90s and early noughties. My sense is that when it went away, in the 80s, it just sort of drifted off into the sunset, didn't it? There was never an official... we're not doing anymore, and there was always the vague talk of, oh, there's going to be a movie, oh, there's going to be an American co-production, and there was, and then the TV movie happened, and it failed. And it failed in about less than 90 minutes, commercially at least. So audio producers, magazine editors, book editors had been gifted this brand spanking new Doctor for the 90s. Very little to go on, either in terms of his characterisation or actually what Doctor Who should look like now, because I think the only thing anyone concluded was from the TV movie was that wasn't the way to do it, at least for Phantom. And so the reason I suggested Sword of Orion was because it's only the second Paul McGann audio, and I feel like Storm Warning has been talked about quite a lot in fandom these days. But I find Sword of Orion in some ways the more fascinating story because it really feels like an alternative attempt at what Doctor Who in 2000, 2001 should look like. It is quite a derivative story in many ways, but I think deliberately so. You know, there's a lot of it which is a collage of bits from existing Doctor Who stories, as you say, from the whole canon that existed at that time.
Yeah.
Held together with bits of Blade Runner and Alien. So it's a sort of alternative version to what Russell T Davies ends up doing of what if we did what Doctor Who used to look like, but with updated references and maybe looking a lot more like the sort of things that everyone's referring to. Because Blade Runner and Alien were pretty much the go-to references for all sci-fi between about 1985 and probably about 2000, whenever The Matrix came out, right? And so it has the four-pot structure, as Big Finish, I think, has only really started to break away from in the last few years. So it has the shape of something that was already out of date by the time the show finished. It has a lot of references that are from stories that came out 30 years previously, some of these.
Yeah. And
it's referring to the things that everyone else is referring to when they make sci-fi. But I really enjoy it because it's that attempt of bringing Doctor Who back and saying, do you know what? Doctor Who's really good, and here is a slab of actually really quite decent Doctor Who action-adventure sci-fi.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I kind of vividly remember seeing that cover for the first time as a kid and thinking, this is it. It's Paul McGann. It's the Cybermen. This is proper Doctor Who. And I remember finding that cover in particular so striking. I don't know why, but I just assumed when they announced it that McGann would be on the cover with the 80s Cybermen or a new Cyberman design of some sort. But instead we get the Invasion Cyberman. And it just blew my mind. That design and the grey, industrial, shadowy feel to that cover. Like you say, it looks like a serious bit of science fiction, at least to my sort of 14-year-old eyes it did.
Yeah, that's the thing as well, because the early Big Finish audio covers were a bit ropey by today's standards, shall we say. But those first four, so my understanding, this is based on probably 20-year-old recollections of reading Big Finish, The Inside Story, is that first McGann series had to come together in fairly short notice, because the impression I get is Paul McGann said, yeah, I'm free in however, a couple of months' time, and suddenly they've got to get 4 sets of scripts together. And so I think part of that, whether that was a result of the rush or a more conscious decision, it's quite an eclectic mix. Each one of them is totally very different from the others, and those covers were so striking. I think these were maybe the first ones where they'd really stepped up their design, but they're the ones, as you say, where they really hit home. And that's something that I think Big Finish doesn't get enough credit for, especially in the early days, is treating Doctor Who as a whole, as an entirety that you can kind of reach in and pull the best bits out of in a way that's quite ahead of its time, because that's how Marvel films treat Marvel comics these days. To a lesser extent, it's how Star Wars properties treat their Star Wars Too Hot for TV canon. And not doing the 80s Cybermen, as you say, even though that would be the fanish thing to have the ones from Silver Nemesis on there, because they're the current ones. No, to go, actually, do you know what? The Invasion are the best look, and especially if you're just going to stick a face on a front cover, that's the one you go with. And again, there's all these weird examples in the Wilderness years of them making the same decisions that would be made by Russell T Davies when they brought it back. And in Dalek, when they give the Cybermen their little cameo in the first season, which Cyberman is it? It's the Invasion Cyberman, because they're the best, and I won't be at it.
No, it's very true. They do pick the best toys from the toy box in those early run. I know we've said it a million times on this podcast, and I'm not the first person to say it at all, but obviously Big Finish these days, it is a cornucopia of absolute fan wank. That's not to say they're not making some good stuff, just it is always... There's always an Auton or a Yeti or something like that. But back then it was really, right, we've got one story a month, and we're going to tell the best story we can tell, and it may contain some things from the past, or it may be something completely new.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes through in... we touched on Paul McGann's performance in this, that it is still youthful and wide-eyed and sounding like that. But that also comes through in the production. Yeah. There is a sense of, oh my God, we're getting to make new Doctor Who, and it's Paul McGann as well, and everything. I think obviously some of them are better than others in that first couple of years, but I struggle to think of any of them that just feel like, here's another one for the pile. And maybe that's nostalgia, but I don't think it entirely is. I think there is a wonder to it. There's so many possibilities. Not just because there was, Big Finish was less than 1% of its current size in terms of its output, but there was just less content in general coming out every month. The Virgin New Adventures and the Doctor Who magazine comic strip had been running, but there wasn't much else.
Whereas the other audios they were doing were slotting them into existing spaces in the canon, this was like a brand new season of Doctor Who, and that's how they treated it.
Yeah, and I completely agree, because this was... not the first Big Finish I listened to, but I think this was the first McGann I listened to. And it was because it was Paul McGann with the Cybermen, looking like a film that you could go and see in the cinema on the front of it. And then when you put it in, and it's recognisably solid Who, but didn't feel like something that was filling a gap, that did feel like it might go somewhere. I mean, the serial element of the first series is a little bit underdeveloped, I think it's fair to say. This is Charlie's second story, and there's a few references to that, but there isn't as much as you might make it these days. And there's Ramsey the Vortisaur, bless him.
I'd forgotten all about Ramsey until this started, and I was like, oh yeah, it was Ramsey the Vortisaur.
Which I love, though, because that is absolutely something that would never make it to audio now. Yeah. And clearly, I say clearly, I'll be 100% wrong in saying this, but clearly, indisputably, that must have been because they said, look, we have to have something linking these together. Yeah. So what if we gave them a pet in the first series? Animal Hospital was big at the time. So Jurassic Park 3 was out, so I'm assuming Usual Suspect style in the BF production office they were looking around. But I love it because it is that thing of them trying to do something and, experimenting with the audio format, because that's the other thing. Again, it's such a cliche to say it these days that, the pictures are better on audio. Yeah. But there is that idea, let's give them a dinosaur. Yeah. And again, it's just an example of, there's a certain overabundance of ideas that speaks to here.
100%. So it's very much a Nick Briggs production. He's the writer, the director, the composer, does the sound design, and obviously does the voices of most of the Cybermen. What are your kind of general thoughts on Nick Briggs?
I think he gets a bit of a bad rap, to be honest, sometimes among a certain generation of fans. But I've always had quite a lot of respect for him, because I think especially in these early days, before he was in charge of it, he was, and I mean this absolutely as praise, he was a solid and dependable writer who could produce stuff that was good,
Yeah.
that had ideas, that was, a step more than pastiche.
Yeah.
Because it feels like it's got slightly lost in the history of Who fandom now. But his Dalek Empire series
Yes.
was a huge success at the time.
Yeah. And it's just a brilliant series.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there and here, I think he writes this quite chunky, masculine sci-fi.
Yeah.
It's not exactly the same as, but it is the cousin, maybe, of that episode of Doctor Who that turns up in every series of the revived Doctor Who, where, it's all ladders and metal gangplanks and people saying like, "Get out of there, Jefferson!" But there was a lot of stuff there that was. I feel like he's also, so you can parody that stuff.
Yeah.
But he's a smart enough writer to undercut that as well. I mean, he gets that stuff is really cool,
Yeah.
as we also understood as children.
Mm-hmm.
But he also undercuts it, so it's silly. But like, you've got all these space salvage teams.
Yeah.
And, people loading guns and putting on spacesuits. But there's different regional voices there.
Yeah.
There's bits where they're just muttering silly things under their voice while they're looking around. And they discuss things like working practices. And they talk about divorce or what their wife's going to think of all this when they get back. And it works. It sells the world, I think.
100%. It's a classic trope, this version of sci-fi, especially of 20th century sci-fi, as you say. It's that aliens thing of real people in space. But I don't think you get a lot of that in Doctor Who previous to this, almost.
No, I think the last few seasons of McCoy begin to gesture towards it in something like Dragonfire,
Yeah.
infamously, is alien shot on a BBC budget. But in fairness, I think something that era often doesn't get enough praise for is also quickly realising what they couldn't do.
Yeah.
I suppose, Eric Saywood tried for that sort of thing in things like Earthshock.
Yeah.
Vengeance from Varos has got a bit of it. But, they couldn't realise it terribly well on the BBC budget at the time, so maybe they stayed away from it. But this feels like a much more successful and complete version of that. I think, actually, something that Briggs and Saywood have in common, I think, is that they're both fans of Robert Holmes, quite clearly, as are 90% of Doctor Who writers. But I think they're fans of his particular type of storytelling. But I suspect, Briggs has a better idea of what made that work. His Cybermen in it are they're violent and they're horrible, but there's something that people run into. There's no celebration of that. It shares that idea with Alien of a kind of mundane hubris about humanity that we've voyaged out into the stars and we've so filled it up with stuff that we're out there salvaging scrap of stuff that's been left behind. And oh no, actually, do you know what? We're not actually top of the dog pile out here anymore, and we've run across something that our greed and our avarice hasn't prepared us for. And I think that thematically ties back really interestingly to things that were going on in 80s Doctor Who in particular, but possibly articulates them a lot better than they were there.
The production kind of benefits from him sort of being this auteur voice almost, because he's putting his 100%, his all into every aspect of this. There's a real atmosphere there, and it's tense and it's scary in places. There are moments in it where I was listening to it and getting kind of genuine chills, because it's almost this haunted house story in space for the first episode while they're clambering around inside this big derelict spaceship. I think he's putting his all into all of it. I do think it has some pacing issues. It's a bit overly long and, it could do with another edit. But overall, I think he just delivers this really well put together production.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think that goes back to what I was saying about that borrowing of elements from earlier stories. I mean, presumably they'll have, I don't know, but I'm assuming they will have expected the McGann audios to sell better than the ones that have gone before, because it's Paul McGann, even if you're only getting more fans on board than you had before. But, potentially a bigger audience. I think this one was repeated on BBC 7, as it then was, quite a few times, which then led to the commissioning of the Lucy Miller Adventures. And it feels like someone who is an absolute Doctor Who fan going, no, look, Doctor Who's really good, and here's why. Not reinventing it, updating it, smoothing off the edges, changing the bits that need to be changed, but going, look, fundamentally, Doctor Who is amazing and scary, and it does action, and it does alien worlds. And as you say, that all comes through. It feels like someone really selling the thing they love.
And it's not quite classic Doctor Who, and it's not quite new Doctor Who. It is its own little contained version of this is this is late 90s, early noughties Doctor Who.
Yeah, 100%. As you say, there are things that make it feel a bit dated now. I agree with you that the pacing, especially in the second half, is a bit off, and I think some of that is inherited from what it's trying to recreate, which is there's a whole bit about the Cybermen can't get into the spaceship because they've disabled the airlock, so the Cybermen spend the better part of an episode building a secondary airlock. Yeah. Which is very clever of the Cybermen, and it gives the other characters an opportunity to talk. Yeah. But it doesn't make for great audio. No. And the end is sort of an Etch-a-Sketch ending of an Ion Storm comes. Spoilers for this 21-year-old's audio. Ion Storm comes and rips it all apart, and they've been setting up the Ion Storm from the very start. So that's okay. Chekhov's Ion Storm. But it is a little bit sort of he creates this really complex web of deceit and betrayal and without it ever quite becoming I bribed the architect first. Yeah. But it does feel like having so tangled it all up, he just basically goes and wipes the slate clean. With again, the only way this can end is with everyone losing. Yes. Is what it feels like it's going towards. In fairness, those are things they would smooth off in time. This is still very early on, and a lot of that is stuff that if you're a Doctor Who fan, you know where it comes from. Yeah. Something I felt was dated in a more interesting way is the use of, you mentioned the use of music and effects in it, which are great. The best door opening sound effect I've heard in anything ever. Like I get it's this grating, ratchety sound each time the doors open, and that somehow just sold. I realised that gave me such a perfect image of or sense of these are old ships. Yeah. These are the hardworking tugboats of the universe, and that's great. But there's also a few moments where, not least in the cliffhangers, which, a story that I otherwise love, the cliffhangers are all poo. They are. The first cliffhanger is a classic Terry Nation, oh my god, it's the Cybermen. Yeah. But you would only know it was a Cyber, because it goes, whoa! And you only know that's a Cyberman because you saw a Cyberman on the front, so you have to draw it together. And then I'm pretty sure one of the other ones is just another sound effects that you're not given any. It's just someone goes, "Oh my god," and something goes crash into the end credits. But I think what that speaks to is their sound design has come on so far. I think someone mentioned in a previous episode of the podcast that Zagreus was the real turning point for that, where it became much more cinematic. There's a few moments when, I think it's the end of episode 2, is the Cyber Leader being reawoken. And if you hadn't watched Tomb of the Cyberman or Earthshock, I don't think you'd know what on earth was going on in that scene. There
are a few moments where just like, what is happening here? And as you say, they've come on a long way. But his sound design, for the most part, especially as you say, that abandoned spaceship, is really great.
Yeah, it is fantastic. And I think these are all things that it's interesting to look back now on something that is a complete other era of Doctor Who. This is, I'm going to do that Twitter thing of, this is as old as, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is as old now, does quick mental maths, as Castrovalva was, or Logopolis was, when this came out. Yeah, retweet it. It is another era. You say it's not classic Doctor Who. It's not new Doctor Who, but it is that glimpse into a form of Doctor Who that we never quite got on TV. Yeah. Because when it came back, which was only 4 years after this, and it was announced 2 years after this, that space still didn't exist for a show like Doctor Who. You know, one of the things that Russell Davies did and is rightly praised for is that he created the space, opened up the space for Doctor Who to slot into, and so many other shows since then. Yeah. Even arguably something like Game of Thrones in terms of UK telly is benefiting from that, you know, shared space for sci-fi fantasy. Yeah. So we don't know what 90s Doctor Who would have looked like on TV. We know what forms of Doctor Who we got. Yeah. Well, we do know it was the TVM, and that's why it didn't work. But we don't know what successful Doctor Who would have looked like in 90s TV. But this, almost more than any other single Doctor Who story, big statement. Yeah. I think for me, possibly feels the closest to what it might have looked like. And I'm not saying it would have been as successful as the Russell T Davies version, but I can picture this.
Yes, me too. I think like one of the things I really enjoy about doing this podcast and dipping into this era of the show is there's always little moments where you're like, I could see Doctor Who being like this in the 90s, in the noughties, and sitting in a TV landscape. One thing this does do, though, is it sets up a spin-off, which comes a couple of years later, because the Orion War, which this sort of hinges on, which is a war between humanity and androids, you know, again, the classic Blade Runner conceit. There was a Cyberman series that I think, if I remember correctly, even reuses the incidental music from this. Have you listen to the Cyberman series at all?
I listened to it when it came out, and I don't remember a huge amount about it, so I don't know that that's much of a praise. But I think that's possibly because what is quite good about the backstory to this is that it works really well as backstory, as context. That whole war between the androids and the humans, and we're sort of on the edges of it. That feels almost like, I'm getting so pseudo-intellectual here, but that almost feels like Greek drama or something. Right. That we're not going to show you the war, we're not going to show you the battle, we're going to show you its implications and its effects on the edges, because we're more interested in the effects of people. And from what I can remember of the series, it's sort of intrigue. I suppose looking back now, it's a little bit Westworldy from what I recall. I've got a memory that they released the cast list, but not who anyone was playing.
Yes, they did that. Also, they recorded them all as live almost, so they kind of did one or two run-throughs of them rather than doing them scene by scene. But it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, I did revisit them, and I found them actually like pretty good bits of drama in a way that I wasn't expecting to. I think the problem they had at the time was Dalek Empire came out and was hugely successful, and like everybody thought it was the best bit of Doctor Who and the Daleks that you could possibly do, obviously without Doctor Who. And I think everyone was expecting that for the Cybermen, but it's a bit more, as you say, intrigue and politics rather than just Cybermen being really mean.
That's good to hear. I need to go back and revisit them, clearly, because I would love it to be really good. Yeah. Because that backstory, like I say, really struck me as quite a clever little bit of storytelling here. I think within this story of how the Cybermen then fit into this conflict between people and people, but artificial people. Trying to get all the nouns right when I'm talking about androids. What happens if you put something in between that? The Cybermen on either side of that. So I'm glad to hear that it's good.
We've talked a little bit about Paul McGann. As you say, he could have literally rushed from the studio in Vancouver straight into this recording studio, and it feels like exactly the same person. And we've also got India Fisher in her second story. Now, I think India Fisher's slightly let down in this story. Like, she's always great, and I love Charlie, but she's very much here to kind of fulfill that traditional role and just to ask the questions and get the answers and to get into peril a little bit. Like, it's not the kind of later character development we get from her.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I don't know if that's a product of the speed with which these scripts were turned around. And, heaven knows they made up for that with season 2, where I think she got one of the best shakes that a companion had up to that point in terms of story development and meat to get into. But she is just there to say, but why, Doctor? And gosh, and to be, especially on quite a full cast anyway, she does end up slotting in. As you say, she is great, and it always amazes me that she's not done more beyond Big Finish, MasterChef obviously, because she is so great. One thing that is interesting though, this is her second, I don't know what order they recorded them in, but this is only her second McGann audio, and I think she'd maybe been in one or two Big Finishes before that, and you can, and I feel for her doing it, but you can hear her getting her head around some of the dialogue at times. I think there's a bit quite early on where Ramsey is not well, and she says something like, "How can we get him to the console room to get him to the vortex?" And there's no reason she should, but I do not believe in that moment that she understood a single one of those words, and neither should she or need she. It's that thing that I can't remember if it was Patrick Stewart or Derek Jacobi or one of the old thesps that was asked about why do so many Shakespearean actors turn up in sci-fi? And they said because we're used to delivering things with emotion without really understanding what they mean. But obviously, she's been doing this for 20 years now. But it was like, oh yes, this is your fourth day in the studio, isn't it? But the grace with which she carries it off is incredible. And as you say, it's a testament to her ability that you are always still conscious of Charlie being there, and it's lovely when she gets to say something, despite the fact that she is so poorly served. I think they put her in peril at the very end, and that's about it.
Yeah, it's one of these things where she'd almost be better off not being there a little bit. Like, it could quite easily just be the Doctor travelling by himself, but obviously he needs someone to talk to, and the talking cabbage never took off.
Well, exactly. I mean, they because it is quite a big cast, and she gets quite a bit to do at the very start when they're exploring the Arizona Bazaar, and that's lovely, and she does get across the wonder of it, which is as much as she gets of, if this were modern Doctor Who, this would be a whole episode that would be all about Charlie's first trip into space.
Yeah.
And what she gets of that is in the first episode, and that works really well. But I do sort of wonder if, when the anti-gravity platforms crashed, whether she should have just been left to lie down in the TARDIS for a bit.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about the cast. So we've got Grash, played by Bruce Montague, who was also in The Genocide Machine. We've got Diva Jensen, played by Michelle Livingston, who is kind of our main protagonist as the captain of the ship, and also comes back in a story called Heart of Orion, which I've never heard. And then we've got Chev, played by Helen Goldwyn, who's done loads of Big Finish and a fair amount of TV. We also have Vol, played by Hilton Collins, Ike, played by Ian Marr, and Kelsey, played by Toby Longworth. Those are sort of the leads. Were there any particular standouts there that you enjoyed at all?
I mean, I'm always amazed whenever Toby Longworth is in something at just what that man can do with his voice. He has one main role here, but he fills in voices in a few other parts. Yeah. And just really struck by his vocal dexterity. He was Judge Dredd for Big Finish as well. He was. They're great. Yeah. They didn't sell at all, and I'm sure I remember them saying the problem was that they sold to people who liked their Doctor Who audios and also liked Judge Dredd, but they didn't sell to Judge Dredd fans. The last one of them they did, which I assume because they knew it was going to be their last one, so they said, well, why the hell not? I think it was called Solo. And he plays every part.
Wow.
And it's a piece that is deliberately about Judge Dredd having to just trawl through everyone in Mega City 1. And they're all Toby Longworth. Wow. And I think you touched on a few of those people cropped up elsewhere in Big Finish and were sort of almost their early repertory company. And I got strangely nostalgic hearing some of their voices, not just because I listened to Sword of Orion endlessly when I was 13, but just that they would turn up in other things. And it's worth mentioning, I didn't realise until I checked the cast list, there's a prologue where another scrap ship comes across the Cyberman ship and are swiftly dealt with to establish the jeopardy. But one of them is Mark Gatiss.
Yeah, who was obviously just part of that early repertoire. He wrote scripts and what have you. I imagine he just wanted to be in the studio or something for the Paul McGann recording, and they were like, well, you can play a little part in this one then. Yeah,
absolutely, and it was great fun. I have actually, although I don't remember Cyberman, I have listened to Heart of Orion. It was only this year. It was one of the 8th Doctor box sets called The Further Adventuress of Charlotte Pollard or something, and it was I think it's meant to be series 1.5 of these early audios, squidged between the first two, with Paul McGann and India Fisher back in the role, recreating that early setup, and it's good fun. And Heart of Orion is the last one. It is the only one that is a sequel to an existing story, and picks up unclear amount of time after this with them being lured back to the Garazona system by Diva's distress call. And the first episode is really good, and the second episode is not very good. And partly because I think there's just a lot of... Sword of Orion occasionally touches on this towards the end, of really explaining the metaphor of, who can even tell the difference between you anymore in this war? You would make a good Dalek, but a bit more solidly delivered. And if I had slight misgivings about its handling in the end here, Heart of Orion really goes in for it, which is a shame, because it's a really nice idea that continues some of the themes from this story about humans and cyborgs, and if one side does this to the other side, does that justify what the other side is doing? And where is the truth of this horrible, messy conflict? And as you say, Diva Jansen is back after 20 years, weirdly with a lot of voice effects over her, which somewhat disguises the fact that she's back.
One of the performances that I just wanted to jump back to is Bruce Montague as Grash. Now, he is one of those typical gruff scavenger types that you do get in Aliens and things like that. But he's not a nasty piece of work. He's just like a rough guy kind of out for his own. But there's a particular standout scene for me where he is being put up for conversion by the Cybermen, and he's screaming at them, threatening them, telling them he's basically, I'm going to beat you up. I don't know, he doesn't say beat you up, but he's like really going at them, and they just go, oh, he's got too much emotional trauma. We can't convert him, and then they just kill him, which I think is a really cool idea, and I think he really sells his death.
Yeah, it is. You're right. That is his performance does make more of what could be an overly familiar character, and that scene is great because we've not actually weirdly talked much about the Cybermen, given this is a Cybermen story. But I think one of the challenges with the Cybermen, and maybe why so many of their stories are a little bit disappointing in one way or another, is because I think if you fully dived into what makes the Cybermen scary, it would in no way be suitable for a tea time show for the family. So I think you have to kind of find ways to mitigate that, to get the point across without going full, death in heaven.
Yeah.
Grandma was alive when we cremated her.
Which I still don't think is very suitable for a tea time
No.
family show. I love those episodes, but you do think, what was he thinking? Yeah,
you do. It's sort of like, I know it made me realise what Mary Whitehouse probably thought when she watched some Robert Holmes. And it was like, they're drowning Doctor Who on TV. But as you say, what's great about that scene is that kind of gets the idea across, which is that they think they're doing you a favour when they convert you, and B, that they just don't care. That's the real problem of the Revenge of the Cybermen, fist-clenching Cybermen going, "Oh, Doctor, excellent." The problem is that you think, no, you're just bastards. But as you say, he is yelling at them, sells it incredibly well. This is a man fighting and screaming for his life in exactly the way that it made me think of when you see hard blokes being arrested on traffic cops, and they just cannot cope with the fact that their agency is being taken off them, that this is not something, and they're just like, oh yeah, okay, well, blup. And it is somewhere where that kind of, for all that the end feels a bit rushed, that is somewhere we're actually just going, oh no, yeah, he's dead now. It's an incredible scene.
As we were saying, like, the Cybermen here, it's their first appearance with the Eighth Doctor. It's their first appearance in Big Finish. It's really trying to undo a lot of the 80s in terms of where the Cybermen were very kind of, despite being devoid of emotions, would say things like excellent, and it's bringing them back to their core thing. And actually, I think the issue is they work here, but once you remove the emotion from those characters, they become quite silent creatures. They're not creatures of many words, and you see this a lot in the new series because they're just efficient and logical, so it's not like they have a chat at any point, or they're going to suddenly do a big monologue or something like that. So you have to make them scary in other ways, which I think this manages through kind of sound effects and people talking about how terrible the Cybermen are, rather than actually having a chat like they do in Earthshock.
Yeah, and they definitely are very clever in the use of the audio design, as we mentioned earlier, because they are able to do stuff that you could never actually show. I mean, I do not think, the one element of this that I do not think would ever make it to TV now is quite the implication of how badly messed up the Cybermen's victims are by this. Yeah. That there is just that distant clanging, that booming, that occasional woo on a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
And then people find them and they're like, oh my god, this is horrible. It is, as you say, haunted house in space. The boogeyman is going to come and get you. Yeah. They are horrible and they are impassive. It's almost like a Friday the 13th or a Halloween. They are just going to get you. Maybe that's what that airlock sequence is aiming for. They're going to get you. It's just, you can keep running and running and running, but they're going to catch up with you eventually. Yeah. You can't go away forever. And when they get you, it's not just going to be the end of you. It's going to be a really horrible end to you as well.
Yeah. So this started life not as a Big Finish story, but as part of a fan range of audios called the Audio Visuals, which Nick Briggs was a part of, amongst many others like Gary Russell. In that range, Nick Briggs also played the Doctor. Were you aware of these, and were you aware that this started life as that?
Not when I first listened to it. Subsequently did become aware of the Audio Visuals. And that this was a remake. Actually, along with Minuet in Hell in the first series are both remakes as well.
Which makes me think, when you were saying about them having to pull this season together quite quickly, maybe part of it was like, okay, what were the best scripts of that run? Maybe we can utilise these and just to give us a bit of a head start.
Yeah, I'm sure that was part of it. And I think again, this is 20-year-old memories. I think also Stones of Venice, which came in between, was based on an outline that Paul Mars had put together for an unsuccessful attempt to get Tom Baker on board.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've not made that up. And so Storm Warning's actually the only one that is an original story for that run.
That would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, especially as Stones of Venice is exactly the sort of story that you would write to try and get Tom Baker back. I love that story, and I love what Paul Mars has done with Tom Baker. But when you know that, like, oh yeah, it's a hornet's nest story, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
But yes, so I hadn't listened to the audio version though until preparing for this podcast, and my understanding from reading around is that apparently Nick Briggs wrote it as something as a bit of an FU, because they'd had complaints from fans about the experimental nature of some of the earlier audiovisuals that had gone off in places that the series wasn't. So he sat down and, right, okay, fine. I'm going to write a Cyberman story where there's loads of them on a spaceship and they're awakening from hibernation and one of them's gone rogue, and just have what you've had before. And then it was one of their bestsellers. Yes. So I'm sure that's probably also why they went back to it. And listening to it for the first time, what really struck me was how similar it is. I think the opening scenes are identical, just the actors have been changed out. The Big Finish version is a bit longer because you're across 2 CDs rather than, I assume the audiovisuals were 2 sides of a tape.
They were, yeah. So
you get a bit more, the Garazone Bazaar stuff, which is lovely colour. Even some of the musical cues are the same.
They're just done in stereo this time as opposed to mono. So, it is almost the same soundtrack.
Yeah, and realising that, so like, oh, okay. But they think, well, why wouldn't you? Because this still really works.
Yeah.
I had listened to a couple of audiovisuals before, but many years ago, and I was struck by how well they stand up. I think if compared to, I mean, maybe I've been lucky, but at least in terms of their production, even compared to a lot of fan-produced stuff these days, they sound, the people in it are, they're committed. They're giving good, solid performances, and the sound design is, obviously it's not on the level of Big Finish, but it's impressive, especially for the time.
Yeah. For a fan production, it's very impressive. In fact, I think it's a better production than Slipback when we listened to that a few years ago for the podcast, and it was just awful. Now, obviously, it has its limitations within the cast. These are not professional actors. It's very much am-dram. But like you say, the production values really, really stuck out for me for what is probably 40 years old, 30, 40 years old, recorded in someone's living room or something.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, I quite liked Nick Briggs as the Doctor, which I couldn't remember anything of his performance previously, but I think he was. I mean, he is a professional actor, but I think he was at the time as well. And it is that thing that Russell T. I wouldn't put his performance on the same level as David Tennant, but it is that thing that Russell T. Davies said of David Tennant as a fan playing the Doctor is, he's not clutching his lapels. And I sort of got a similar feeling to that with Nick Briggs' performance, which is he's a fan playing the Doctor, but he's not giving a particularly fanish performance. And maybe that's why he is the best remembered fan Doctor. That's why he turns up in the Doctor Who magazine comic strips.
Yeah.
Because it's a performance that feels like it deserves a bit of a fair shake by the canon. So actually, do you know what? That was a thing that was done, and it was good, and we liked it. And thank you, Nick.
He gives it his all, and it's quite a Davison performance if I'm looking for a comparison. Like, it's a lot subtler, and he's a bit snappy, but in a kind of smoother, quieter way than, say, a bombastic Colin Baker or something like that. And while I don't think he's going to sit inside the canon alongside John Hurt, but it's still nevertheless a competent performance by someone who's giving it their all playing the Doctor.
And unless we'd forgotten that this was made in the late 80s, he is a junkie. The character is a junkie, not Nicholas Briggs.
Of course.
For the avoidance of doubt, it leads in with an ongoing storyline that I don't know, but where he is addicted to some fictional drug, and he's getting and there's a discussion over whether he's having cold turkey or not.
Yeah, do you know what though? I will say, as much as I prefer the Big Finish version, and it is a better production all round, it was shorter. I felt like some of the pacing issues weren't present in the AV version.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the very sudden end is still there. And weirdly, having said a few times that this feels like a version of Doctor Who that could be on TV, pacing-wise, actually the original version feels closer because of the runtime, because of what they've got available. They do land straight on the spaceship. There isn't the bit with them running around in Garazone Bazaar trying to get on. And I think it might be a bit difficult to go back and listen to the Big Finish version now and not just see that as padding. For all that it creates a bit more of a world, I don't know that there's anything essential in the BF version that wasn't in this original version either.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was also very briefly advertised as a film that BBV would make, but ultimately never made. But it was actually a bit of a... It was Bill Baggs just trying to drum up interest in a potential Cybermen project, because Briggs said that it was never going to be an actual adaptation. Baggs just put the title out there because he knew people loved the story, and so they would hopefully almost pre-order this video that never came out.
I mean, that's... Having read the excellent book Downtime, The Lost Years of Doctor Who by Dylan Rees, that does sound like the sort of wheeze that I can imagine. But you've also made me a bit sad because of just how easily I can imagine the BBV version of this production in my head, and it would be fans in ill-fitting cyber suits running around the HMS Belfast, and I feel like that might not achieve what the very excellent sound design achieves in both versions.
Yes, I think we all had a lucky escape from the BBV Cybermen film that never was. I think eventually it turned into Cyberon, which we can talk about that another time. Is there anything else you want to say about Sword of Orion?
I don't think so. I think we covered most. I did write down the line, quote, "terrible thing this interbreeding," which is certainly delivered with a level of irony. But I did think, 2001 was longer ago than I thought it was, wasn't it?
Okay, so is it a clanger or is it a banger?
It's a banger.
It's 100%.
I don't think 13-year-old me would allow me to say anything else.
There we go. That is Sword of Orion, a certified banger from us.
Too hot for TV.
So the next thing we're covering is Dreadnought, which is another 8th Doctor story featuring the Cybermen, which was a comic strip printed in the Radio Times. Now, before we chat about that, I just want to know, are you a comics fan in general? Do you read or have you read many comics of any genre, and how you feel about Doctor Who comic strips too?
Yeah, I'm I was going to say I'm a big comics fan, but that's quite a statement to make when you know quite how big some comics fans are. But I've certainly always read them, from Sonic the Comic back in the 90s right through to now, still dipping in and out of Marvel and DC.
Yeah.
Doctor Who comics, I don't think I really missed one between probably around early noughties through to around end of the Capaldi era in DWM. And I think you're spoilt as a Doctor Who fan, really, in terms of comics, and tie-in comics even more so. Tie-in comics, I think, are often quite weak sauce, just there as a bit of, a bit of a cash grab, a bit of filling stuff in on the side for people who want a bit more of that. Perhaps because of, when the DWM launched, it was so many great creatives from 2000 AD, John Wagner, Steve Moore, Alan Moore a bit later on, that I just think they're fantastic, and still try and keep up with them now when DWM put out their collected editions. Yeah. But big fan, and these are... these Radio Times ones are this odd little lacuna off to the side.
I think, as you say, we are spoilt for choice with Doctor Who comics. I think at their worst, they can just be a bit of a generic 3 or 4 part Doctor Who story with a generic monster. But at their best, there are these fantastic tales that sprawl not just time and space, but the imagination of the artists and stuff like that. And, the best ones do really interesting stuff. And I'm particularly a fan, obviously, of the DWM 8th Doctor run, of which this is not. But it is an 8th Doctor comic. So, Dreadnought ran in the Radio Times from the 1st of June to the 3rd of August 1996. At the time, fandom was very much reeling from the excitement/disappointment of the TV movie, depending on your point of view, and everyone was waiting on news of a new series, which ultimately never came. The Metropolitan Police announced they were bringing back police boxes, and this also never materialised. John Pertwee had just died. The TV movie aired in America and failed to attract the audience that was hoped for. BBV announced they were shooting 2 more probe videos in the form of Unnatural Selection and The Ghosts of Winterborn. Virgin lost their licence, and the comic strip running was ground zero. Missing Adventures at the time were The Killing Ground, Scales of Injustice, and Shadow of Weng Chiang. The New Adventures were God Engine, Christmas on a Rational Planet, and Return of the Living Dad. While A History of the Universe by Lance Parkin was published, I Was a Doctor Who Monster was on VHS, and obviously the novel of the film and the VHS and the script book of the film were all released. We talked a bit about the TV movie before. I wonder if any of those books or the comic strip or anything is something you've experienced?
Only latterly, having been sent to bed, I certainly wasn't going to be allowed to go and buy any adult Doctor Who books. And I think my video watching was still very much in the Hunchback of Notre Dame rather than BBV at that stage. But it's quite... laying it all out like that, it really does feel like a sort of best of times, worst of times, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like there's all these great books and other things coming out, but at the same time, Doctor Who had come back and then gone away again just as quickly. John Pertwee had passed away. Virgin had lost their licence. It does feel like it's all for what feels, looking back at it now, as a new start, because we knew everything that would happen with McGann between then and the series. And as you say, with Doctor Who magazine and the Big Finish audios and the books, the heights it would reach.
Yeah.
It feels like a beginning to us now, but back then, as a Doctor Who fan, it must have felt like, they were putting the shutters up.
Yeah, no, it does have a closing down sale feel almost. And actually, if you flick through the DWMs at the time, Virgin are selling off all their old stock, and they have these big sales of the New Adventures and the Missing Adventures where you can get a load of them cheap because they obviously won't be allowed to sell them at a certain point. And I remember as a kid buying about 10, 15 of these Missing Adventures and then just staring at the covers and never reading them. I tried to read them, but in terms of kind of the sort of reader I was as a kid, I don't think they were a bit too complicated for me. I've obviously since been back and read them, but I literally just had a selection of them sat on a shelf that I never ever read.
Such a strange idea to think that there were people sat there with stacks of late era Virgin novels going, no one's going to buy these. Come on. God's sake, do you want a cold fusion? Here, have 3.
Yeah, no, it literally was that. And obviously we live in a world now where those things go for like 50, 60, £100.
Yeah, I tried to buy The Dying Days on eBay in a fit of pique a couple of months ago. I thought I was going to get it for a steal or something like, I don't know, £15 or something like that. It ended up going for 92 quid, I think it was.
Yeah.
It's madness.
I picked up The Dying Days recently and I got it for cheaper than
92 quid. It was you!
Yeah. Didn't even want it, I was just trying to piss you off.
Too hot for TV.
On the spaceship Dreadnought, Stacy and her fiancé Bill are on the run from the Cybermen. Bill is caught while Stacy runs into the Doctor. When the Cybermen eventually capture the Doctor and Stacy, they find Bill has been converted. The Cybermen threaten Stacy in an attempt to force the Doctor to reveal the Time Lord's secrets of time travel. The Doctor takes the Cybermen aboard the TARDIS, where Stacy makes Bill remember their relationship, and so Bill sacrifices himself to save her as the Cybermen are flung into the vortex, while the Doctor and Stacy head off into time and space in the TARDIS.
Too hot for TV.
So, Dreadnought. This debuted the week after the BBC One airing of the TV movie in 1996. So I think this is the first official second story of the Eighth Doctor, if that makes sense. There's certainly no Big Finish, no DWM comic strip, and no books. So this is Paul McGann's first official continuation in spin-off media. So I guess, do you think it does a decent job of carrying on the Eighth Doctor's run?
I mean, I think it does. It's essentially, for those, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's essentially a newspaper strip.
Yeah.
So it's 2 lines, a few boxes each week, probably the equivalent of maybe a scene.
Yeah.
In a if that in a normal comic. So it is working under very tight constraints in terms of what it can do. There's just enough time to set up the peril and move it on to the next scene each week. But there is it really hits the ground running. I think, as you say, this was the first Doctor Who 8th Doctor spin-off following the movie. There was DWM and the books. I think the books didn't get around to the 8th Doctor until about a year afterwards because of the lead-in times and the TVM having happened so quickly.
While.
And I did read these at the time because I loved the TVM, and when I got to see it, and then saw this and was addicted by it. And so I think I have to bow to the assessment of my younger self, who was much more the target audience than long in the tooth Doctor Who fan me now in his 30s. I think it was also, I remember, it begins with the Cybermen already on the ship, and Stacy, who will become the Doctor's companion, and her fiance on the run.
Yeah.
And this was my first experience that I remember of anything beginning in media res. And I was a bit confused by it as a kid. I was like, oh, but it says part 1, but was there one last week? But how would that work? But despite that, I got really into it really quickly. There's a wonderful economy of storytelling within it. It's just written by Gary Russell, who, very experienced Doctor Who writer by this time, I think had written quite a few of the Doctor Who magazine strips.
He had, but also he did the novelisation of the TV movie. So he was the McGann guy, I guess, in the eyes of the BBC.
But I think that it doesn't get a huge amount of time to explore. I suppose one of the challenges that this doesn't have to properly grapple with that, say, the books did or the comic strip is, by its nature, it's 10 parts long, but they're very short, and you have to make space for action and other characters as well. It doesn't feel like you have to dive too deeply into who the Eighth Doctor is or how he would react to situations that were not presented on screen. So to that extent, it does feel like the Eighth Doctor. He also does a trick that I think I remember quite a few writers doing in the early days of the Eighth Doctor, which is, well, we'll write him a little bit like some of the other Doctors. We'll give him, so he does the, when I say run, because that's fair enough. It's a shorthand. It's quite striking coming off the back of Sword of Orion, looking at Dreadnought and going, oh, hang on a minute, it's the Cybermen attacking an industrial spaceship.
Yeah.
And the Eighth Doctor's there, and it ends with them all being blown out into space.
Yes. It's very similar.
And then you go, hang on a minute, wasn't Gary Russell involved in the audiovisuals? You go, hang on a minute.
It's probably one of these things that's almost subconscious. I bet he didn't even realise he was doing a sort of mini version of Sword of Orion. But, it's kind of the obvious thing to do. And as you say, he has to be very economic with his storytelling. So it is Doctor Who by numbers. And I guess you don't get more, as you were saying, Sword of Orion was almost written as to be Doctor Who by numbers in response to the critical mauling that some of their more experimental releases got. But, I mean, he does a good enough job of telling a story over 10 parts with 6 or 7 panels in each one, and he has to come up with 9 cliffhangers, which is just, you can't even describe them as real cliffhangers, but like it has to be something to make people come back the next week, and I just feel for the man having to go through that.
Yeah, I mean, the image that stuck with me as a kid, and so I will say remains one of the best Doctor Who cliffhangers ever, regardless of what anyone else thinks, is the cliffhanger where he's confronted with the robot version of himself.
Oh, God, yeah, with his cyber hair.
With his cyber hair.
Yeah.
And, but as a kid, I was like, I mean, I was the sort of child at the time who enjoyed Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic the comic, and there was lots of recognisable characters being turned into robot versions of themselves there.
Yeah.
I think it was quite a 90s cliche.
Yeah.
But it's such an arresting image.
No, it looks great.
And I do think it's easy as a Doctor Who fan to just approach, all of these, I was going to say texts, but God, that's wanky. All of these stories from a sort of, level playing field of Doctor Who fan, what's the next thing to consume? But this was in the Radio Times, the best-selling magazine in the UK. This must be the biggest audience that a Doctor Who tie-in media had until the height of Tennant era Who, surely, or getting close.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair to say.
Millions of people would have read this every single week. And so in terms of going, like Chris about Sword of Orion, saying, this is Doctor Who, it's great, this is why it's great, look, it's the Cybermen, they're going to get you. Look, he's been turned into a robot, how exciting. It's doing a lot of Doctor Who by numbers, but again, it's presenting that to a very big audience. And also I think, again, in common with a lot of that post-TVM tie-in stuff, The Dying Days occurs to me as one. It is also, at the same time, maybe trying to correct what, as fans, you might feel are some of the faults of the TVM, rightly or wrongly. That there were no monsters apart from the snake. So the Cybermen, they're there, bam, in the first panel. And I think it does that really well. And that image of the robot doctor, to a kid, to the audience that arguably the TVM should have been aiming at much more than it was. Yeah. It works really, really well. It is the sort of thing that as a kid lives in your head. It has playability. You can draw it. You can go out and pretend to be it. And I think particularly for a comic strip, because also it sort of anticipates they would do a version of that on screen with Nightmare in Silver and Matt Smith.
And not as well.
Not as well.
Yeah, that's right.
But-
I'm slagging off Neil Gaiman, one of the foremost writers of fantasy in the world, and I'm saying that a Radio Times comic strip did it better.
Twitter's gonna come for you. Honestly, they're gonna draw little cartoons of him like hitting you with love or something. I don't know.
I have to say though, like, a Cyberman version of the Doctor, we can laugh about it and say it's silly, but I mean, it was only 2 seasons ago that the Cybermen were wearing capes on television, so, you know. Is it any more silly?
Say what you like, though. It's an arresting image, isn't it? It's something. It's something that stays with you. And again, as a kid, that's the sort of thing I think kids really love, that remixing, that variation on the same. It's why, you know, so many of us still love a Dalek variant, because it's a change on the template. It's a nice bit of playing around. And I do think, in particular in terms of working in a comic strip, the version of the Doctor that is a cyber-haired parody works really well. I don't think you could do that version on TV, because he would just be a bit too blank-faced. You know, what's he going to do?
Yeah.
Just stand there and go, "I'm the Doctor, really." But it's such a good image.
It reminds me of the Cyberman Time Lord hybrid that you get in the Timeless Children. Like, they want the Doctor for the same reason, to be the Cyber Lords of Time, as it were. So it's got ideas in it that will be revisited, as you say, in both that and Nightmare in Silver.
Yeah, and I suppose it speaks to, I think Russell T Davies said something about the next Doctor and the Cyber King in that, which he said he had a theory that the Cybermen are fascists, or that at least there is an element of fascism to them in that kind of elevation of man and the image of man as something. And, you know, I think that is captured in both the, what did they call them, Cyber Lords?
Yeah.
Time Lord Cybermen? And the Cyber Doctor here. There is a sort of grotesque parody to them, which I think, again, sort of gets to the heart of, when they're done well, what makes the Cybermen a really affecting villain is that element of the grotesque about them.
Yeah, I think so. And I really like the design of them here. I mean, they've got that classic Cyberman shape, but they look quite bulky and menacing. They've given them red eyes as a sort of Terminator homage and stuff. But I think it's a really cool variant of the Cybermen.
Yeah, there's a sort of techno-organic element to there, isn't there? That they're all metal, but there's the suggestion of a rib cage, and there's some softer lines in there that maybe hint into their internal organs, which is nice because they're not Cybermen. I've never been a big fan of the Cybus style ones, because I think they are just too much men in suits. Yeah, I think you need something to remind you that they're not that, and that's what the threat is. I think it's quite a 90s design as well.
It is very much so.
It is a little bit Marvel Comics, rippling muscles, very, very contorted poses, but not too far. Because it's not like when you see those stills of the Cyberman, the design they did for the unmade 30th anniversary special, The Dark Dimension, where they are just skeletons with roboty bits. That's too much. Yeah. This feels like quite a nice little in-betweeny version.
Exactly.
It's my critical analysis.
You also get we standardly get a cyber leader who's sat on a weird, almost gothic cyber throne. It's one of the things, TV Doctor Who's guilty of it as well, but I've never understood when you see a Cyberman sitting down, why they are sitting down. Because that is not something that they should need to do, right?
Do you know what you've reminded me of? Stuart Lee was interviewed about being in Real Time,
right?
Which also, the Big Finish audio webcast, Real Time, which also features Cybermen, also designed by Lee Sullivan.
Yes.
And he's a big Star Trek fan, and he said Star Trek is better than Doctor Who. And his reason was that when he was in Real Time, he decided to play his character with a Brummie accent. And halfway through, his character gets turned into a Cyberman. So he asked the director, so now I'm a Cyberman, does my character still speak with a Birmingham accent? Or does the cyber conversion process override the parts of the brain that control accent? And he said the director looked at him and said, I don't know. And he said, and Star Trek is better because in Star Trek there would be a book on that. And I sort of feel that in Star Trek, which this comic strip hints at in places, that someone would have explained to you, actually, I think you'll find that Cybermen have to sit down because otherwise their motor joints seize up because of the lower gravity on Earth than Mondas.
Yeah, that sounds fair enough. I'll go with it, but I still don't like seeing a Cyberman sat down. It's these little things as a fan. They're just stupid things that tick you off for no reason. But, I'm not going to write an essay about it. As we were saying, the 8th Doctor is a very generic version of the Doctor, needs to be, so he does throw out the catchphrases of, like, when I say run, run, and things like that, because you have to immediately make it the Doctor without any kind of depth, and obviously he reverses the polarity of the neutron flow, all that stuff. The TARDIS's neutron flow in this occasion. The Cybermen also say resistance is futile, which I thought was an interesting little nod there.
Yeah, there are. I spotted that, and then I began to realise there is a fair bit of Star Trek in it, just little things that are peeking through. And again, I think you certainly this is in some of the novels of the time. I think in particular, is it Lords of the Storm? The Missing Adventure is pretty much a Star Trek novel that the Doctor's been dropped into. Yeah, there are things. So resistance is futile. There's a reference to the Cybermen having a hive. Yeah, which is very Borg. And the robot Doctor that we've spent so long talking about, that's just Locutus of Borg. Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's Patrick Stewart in his makeup. Yeah, and I can't really fault it for that, because Star Trek in the 90s was really big and was probably the most successful form of just bold space opera sci-fi there was. Otherwise, it was stuff that was like the X-Files. So it's maybe not surprising it would sneak in, but it is a telling little detail of the time, isn't it?
Well, I think it's this thing of, I sort of vaguely remember this strip was on a Doctor Who specific page in the Radio Times, which quickly turned into a generic sci-fi page. Because I think they just jumped the gun a little bit and were thinking, the new age of Doctor Who is here, the TV movie, and then we'll have Doctor Who forever, and then all of a sudden they're left with this comic strip and then writing articles about a programme that isn't on TV anymore. So it quickly becomes a generic sci-fi page. But, as you were saying, mainstream TV had a lot of sci-fi on it in the 90s. There was the X-Files, the Outer Limits reboot, all of the Star Trek stuff, Babylon 5, and then things like Sliders and Space Above and Beyond and stuff like that. Do you think there was a place for Doctor Who in that landscape?
I mean, I suppose that's the question that a lot of this stuff in the TVM, I guess, was trying to ask, wasn't it? It was trying to answer. I think the ultimate answer is there probably wasn't, which is why it didn't come back. And I think if anyone's read or was up for reading Jim Smith's Black Archive on Night of the Doctor, he talks quite eloquently about the Time War as being a metaphor for the fact that there just wasn't a place for the Doctor in the universe. The universe doesn't need a Doctor anymore. And I do think that is true, because a lot of that stuff, quite tellingly, that you named is American. So I think US imports of sci-fi were hugely successful. They used to have evenings. Was it Monday? It probably shifted around, but I remember Monday or Tuesday evenings being when you'd have the Star Trek repeats, and later on you'd have Farscape and things like that. Yeah. At home, there wasn't. UK TV, there wasn't much sci-fi at all. Not just Doctor Who. And in fact, if anything, I suspect people would sometimes have thrown Doctor Who out in a sort of dismissive way of why we don't do Doctor Who anymore, darling. To the extent that when things would slip through, they'd have to disguise themselves. I think Colin Breaker is one of the people behind Bugs, and he's talked about the fact that they had to pretend it wasn't sci-fi. They had to say, anything that happens in Bugs is stuff that could happen in the real world. And of course it wasn't. It's all rubbish. It's all made up. But you sort of had to kind of slip it through. Like, the X-Files was acceptable in the mainstream because people could say, it's not really sci-fi, it's a conspiracy thriller, which is why there's a man who can contort himself down chimneys in it. It's basically All the President's Men. So I don't think there was. I mean, this is something we've come back to a few times in this podcast. It is fascinating to try and see people successfully and joyously trying to create a form of Doctor Who that works. There's lots of other versions that I'm sure you've covered on the podcast and will in the future for people to go out and discover. Vampire science in the novels. The DDM comic strips were doing great stuff with Izzy at the time, who was exactly a fan of all the stuff we've mentioned. I don't think there was, but I absolutely love and cherish of this era that people so try to make it work and to still say, do you know what? Even if the mainstream doesn't care, Doctor Who is still great, and you can still do a 90s form of him. And I think if people hadn't believed that, and latterly a noughties version, then it wouldn't have come back, because it was that continued belief in people like Russell T Davies and the less fanish, but TV insiders, that kept it coming back. Shows don't do that. Sliders isn't being kept the flame alive by people's no, look, honestly, just think of all the social satire we could have now in Toronto or Vancouver or wherever they shot it. That doesn't happen with shows. Look at the problems they're having the whole team behind Life on Mars are trying to get a new version of that off the ground, despite it being a BBC classic. So that's why I have so much affection. There wasn't a place for Doctor Who in the 90s, but people believed there could be and pushed for it, and through their joy kept it alive.
That's very true. I mean, I don't have too much more to say on Dreadnought, but we obviously get this companion Stacy, who is never mentioned in the great pantheon of Doctor Who companions that
not true.
Almost were.
Not true. I'm sorry. I've checked the wiki.
I don't recall Paul McGann mentioning her name in the Night of the Doctor when he was regenerated.
Don't say that. Don't say that. He didn't mention Fitz either. It's weighed on me since.
I think she's the thing that suffers the most from this comic strip because it's really hard to establish any form of character. But going in, you know roughly what Cybermen are, you know roughly who the Doctor is. So trying to give this companion any backstory or depth just isn't possible in this kid's comic, essentially.
No, I think you're right, and I think it is one of those cases of, as a Doctor Who fan, maybe having a sense of what the format is. And again, this was something Ross Davis was quite clever at, realising what bits do you keep and what bits do you get rid of. As a Doctor Who fan, of course, there needs to be a companion. But you do wonder, and maybe that's fine in this story. There needs to be someone there for the Doctor to save, bluntly, is what she does. There needs to be someone there to give it that emotional investment in what's occurring rather than the Doctor. But did she need to continue? Did she need to carry on in subsequent ones? Or with it being such a confined space, could you actually have just carried on with just Paul McGann going from place to place? But yeah, you're absolutely right. It does feel like something that it commits to. I'd
completely forgotten that they give him another companion. So there's 3 of them in the rest of the run of the strip, and this one in the next run is an ice warrior.
Yes, I mean, this for me as a kid was where it sort of came off the rails a bit, which is that. So this is a very quick read now, if you can get your hands on a copy of it. But it was 10 weeks. You know, that's a summer holiday and a half again of storytelling. The story after this is another 10 parts and is the first half of a 2-part epic set on Mars, which is 20 weeks. That's, almost half a year of just red backgrounds. That feels to me like that's maybe where I'm sure it's not why it ended, but that to me feels like as a kid that's where I started to drift away from it a bit.
It ran for 42 issues, this strip, so that is basically, it's just short of a year. As you say, it's basically 4 10-parters and then 1 2-parter because it was cancelled. And the storyline that was running involved shapeshifters that were going to be revealed to be the Zygons. But he had to wrap it up in basically 2 parts, so it never really went anywhere. It was just a very generic, short 2-part story about shapeshifters.
Yeah, in fact, you've reminded me, don't they even set up that cliffhanger at the end of the preceding story where... I've got a memory of a frame that's just Stacy with glowing eyes and saying something like, ha ha ha. But then, it just goes into that 2-parter where there's had I had too many Haribo that day, but are there purple horses in that story?
I can't remember, but there's a possibility there was.
I need to look this up because I've just got an image in my head and I need to know if I need to have a lie down.
Apparently, Stacy and Sard, the Ice Warrior, show up in the book The Placebo Effect. Are you aware of that?
They do. I got a copy of that when loads of EDAs were going cheap in the works just before the show came back. I've got a memory and I've got stacks of them. And I was reading it and I was really surprised because I'd not thought about Stacy and Sard in best part of 10 years at that stage.
Can you remember how they show up in it?
I can, because I really enjoyed that book. And it's the Doctor takes Sam, who's his companion in the books, to their wedding because they're getting married. And that's the into the book. So the first part of the book is dealing with the fact that Stacy and Sard are getting married, and on a planet that's also going to host the Olympics, I think.
Right. In the 90s, people were always fucking Ice Warriors, weren't they? I feel like that happens in the New Adventures as well.
I was a child. I wasn't on the scene. There is, an underappreciated legacy of the New Adventures is a horniness to Doctor Who that has never really left the show since.
There was also a similar series pitched by Gary Russell and Lee Sullivan when the Radio Times, I think, were planning to do a sci-fi magazine, and it featured an entirely new 9th Doctor created specifically for the comic strip, but it would have been the same format of half a page.
That would have been very interesting to see, wouldn't it?
I think there's one that exists out there, that they did as basically a demo of it, so it appeared on Twitter a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean that would have been fascinating, and perhaps the fact that that magazine didn't take off is, speaks to that slightly paradoxical nature of, do we like sci-fi in the 90s or not? Of all these shows being successful, but there apparently not being a market for stuff that tied into it. I would have been interested in that, but it is quite telling that, I mean, from what you've said, I'm assuming the timings were not long after this, just how quickly people would have felt the need to introduce a new Doctor, given that Paul McGann, the Eighth Doctor, would continue to be treated as the current Doctor in comic strips and audios and novels right up to 2005. But it is interesting that at that time of the late 90s, people were already thinking, no, we need a reset here to establish that this is something different.
But that Doctor would have he'd be in the same canon as the Schalke Doctor now, I think.
Or the one from the sweet cigarettes in the 60s, who's a sort of generic Doctor they don't have to pay an image license for. Yes.
Is it a clanger or is it a banger?
Oh, do you know what? I'm gonna say a banger. But it's on a technicality, which is that I really enjoyed it as a kid. Unlike Sword of Orion, which I went back to and felt really stood up and enjoyable. This, I think, it's not designed to be read in the way you have to read it now, and you cannot read it now in the context for which it was intended. So if anyone go back and revisits it off the back of this, it's a curio.
Yeah.
But it certainly worked for me as a kid at the time who wanted more Doctor Who, having really enjoyed the TV movie and then not got any more.
Yeah. Do you know what? I remember it being cancelled, this run, and it being announced in DWM and being quite gutted because it felt like another nail in the coffin, weirdly, for Doctor Who.
I can imagine that, because you say this ran for almost a year, long after it had been and gone. I mean, imagine, did any other bank holiday special get a spin-off that ran for a year in the Radio Times for ages afterwards?
No,
there wasn't a year-long Jonathan Creek newspaper style strip running in the Radio Times. But I can imagine, it must have been quite a bleak time to be a fan. 1997, 1998.
But despite being gutted about that, I'm afraid I do have to say that it is a bit of a clanger for me. I got strangely nostalgic about it, and I understand its limitations, but I was kind of a bit bored shit by the 10 minutes it took me to read it.
That is quite the damning that it bored you in 10 minutes and it was meant to be read across 10 weeks. But I mean, the truth of this is, do we have dramatic newspaper strips in the UK these days? I mean, even by the 90s, they must have been.
No.
I've tried reading some of those collected James Bond ones where they go, "Hey, look, there's more James Bonds," and they're all from like the 80s and stuff. And it's basically each week is reading it now. You feel like you're constantly being slapped across the face while you're trying to read a proper graphic novel because it keeps re-establishing itself. And being James Bond, there's just enough space to be a bit sexist as well.
Well, I'm sure that'll be a Doctor Who Too Hot, a James Bond Too Hot for TV spin-off, where we look at those. So we've come to the end of our conversation, talking about what is essentially the same story 3 times over. But nevertheless, it was the Eighth Doctor encountering the Cybermen for the first time twice, which was great fun. So, Michael, thank you very much for joining me today. Where can people find you on the internet, should they wish to find you?
Should they wish to? I'm on Twitter. You can find me at callmekenneth, which is call_me_Kenneth, which I came up in a fit of personal branding. If you want more of this wittering in a sort of 1 episode a week for 10-week format, I'm spaffing it out there.
Great. Well, as I said, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. Next time, I'm joined by John Isles of the Tripods cast. But we're not talking tripods. We are talking about the BBV Sontaran audio, Old Soldiers. And then a couple of things we're doing a little differently. We're going to do the target book of the Sea Devils, which, although we don't do Doctor Who on TV, we thought we'd give a target book a go. And we're going to take a brief look at the Making of Silver Nemesis documentary that was on the VHS many, many years ago. So that will be next month. But until then, I've been Dylan.
And I've been Michael.
And this is Doctor Who Too Hot for TV.
on TV.
I have to ask about the Ken Loach anecdote.
Yeah, this was fittingly for doing this remotely. This was I was interviewing him probably about 10 years ago now for one of his documentaries that came out about why socialism was and remains great. This was very early days of, young ingenue film journalist trying to work out how to record something on his iPhone that he's had for about 2 weeks. I downloaded a bit of lovely software that I thought would do it amazingly, and it was all going swimmingly as far as I was concerned until Ken Loach just was saying, I'm really sorry, but you're sounding a bit like a robot, like a Dalek. I can't work out what's going on. And I was like, I'm so sorry. But presumably he was hearing, I'm so sorry. So eventually he said, I'll ring off and call you back. And the thing about, at least I found from my brief interview with him, was that it was a bit like talking to someone's rather lovely granddad on the phone. He's like, okay, you'll call back then, will you? And so I called back and spoke to the lovely agent. I was like, hello, sorry, can I go back to Ken, please? And managed to get through the rest of it without embarrassing myself quite too badly.
Brilliant.
Too hot on TV.
I forgot to mention in the AV version of Sword of Orion was I forgot to mention the London Cyberman. I realise that's a callback, so I can't include it. But there was a bit where one of the Cybermen went, all right. Something like that.
There was.